So, Simon, please take us on your journey and tell us how things unfolded for yourself to start and go through a transition process to steward ownership.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to do so. Lisa and Nati asked, I think, all of us to compile a couple of slides, which I also did. And on the other hand, I really want to keep it crisp and short, that we also have a little bit more time to exchange and to discuss afterwards. So very quickly, who is the Dive? What do? We are in the realm of organization development and transformation. So activity-wise, the main things we do is consulting. So we accompany other organizations from small to large, from small, medium enterprises to corporates in their respective transformation processes. We also provide trainings in particular areas, which I'm going to point out a little bit later. And this is maybe concerning the topic of steward ownership, maybe the most interesting part is that we also see ourselves being kind of a lab or a prototype for a new style organization. Because if you have the feeling that the economic system or that organizations should or could change, it's always easy to point at the others, like you over there, you should change. But on the other hand, we are, of course, also part of the economic sector. And we also produce economic reality day by day by day. And so we always try to be very credible in what we do and in how we apply maybe also new ideas and new concepts to ourselves. And the last part which comes with that is that we also are pretty active in ecosystem community building, because you can't change the system on your own, but it needs a bigger movement, obviously. And when we founded the company in 2015, that's like 10 years ago, we just turned 10 this year, we already had kind of, I mean, it wasn't that polished, but we had kind of this purpose that with everything we do, we want to contribute to an economy which serves life. And we heard in the morning already about the fact that our economic model is obviously broken, and that we definitely need to change our economic model, or that we have to find an economic model which stays inside the planetary boundaries, for example, which contributes also to social equality and all those questions which have already been risen in the morning. And that's what we try to do with the means of organizational development. So we are not the politicians. We can't work, at least not directly, on the regulation. We can't work on the regulatory systems. But what we can do is accompany other companies, other organizations with methods, with cultures, with tool sets on their way to what we call a regenerative or a life-centric organization. And we had, on our journey, we had the first touch points with steward ownership quite early, but not, interestingly enough, not concerning the Dive ourselves, but concerning a spin-off. Because in 2017 or 18, we developed a project at the Dive, which later on became a print magazine, which is called Neue Narrative, a German print magazine, which deals with topics like new ways of working and new ways of designing the economy. And then at some point, this was kind of a passion project, to be honest, and we didn't have a business plan behind that. We just got off with it. And then at some point, of course, we had to ask ourselves, for how long do we as the Dive want to carry like the entrepreneurial risk? And then we decided that we are financing the first 6 issues of the magazine. And at this point, it had to be clear if there are people who are willing to take the entrepreneurial risk. And then we spun it off, and gladly and happily enough, there were people who were willing to do that. And we spun off this magazine already in the form of a steward-owned company. So, of course, where it was about this kind of spin-off process, we had to deal with all those questions which you were already touching upon. This is a very complicated chart. It gets easier when I just walk you through, maybe. So we have our own preliminary idea of how a life-centric organization could look like and what could be the dimensions where you could take a look at if you really want to become a regenerative or life-centric organization. And maybe to point you to the left side first. There are like 5+1 dimensions where we try to keep an eye on, starting with the purpose, of course, like what are we here for as an organization, apart from just making money as a for-profit organization. And then, like pretty much in the deep, am I still there? Yeah. Pretty much in the deep design of the organization, of course, you're touching upon those questions of who has power in the company, who is participating economically in the company, like everything we talk about here. Then the next layer would be about finance, like how do you structure your economic processes in the organization? How do you deal with transparency, for example? We heard in some of the workshops about transparent salary systems and all that kind of stuff. How can you foster entrepreneurial thinking in the organization based on open book and transparent models? Then it's about the organizational operating system, like how does such a kind of a living organism look like, and how can you also design the processes and the structure and the governance concerning the organizational operating model. Then, of course, it comes to service delivery, and as we are not just on our own, but as it's about really building relations to other stakeholders, it's of course a lot about also this +1 dimension of ecosystem building. And what you can see on the right is that we for many of those dimensions, we had found our preliminary answers. So of course we started with this kind of strong purpose at the Dive that we want to contribute to a new economic model with everything we do. And then you can see 3 books because we created own methods and frameworks, so we do a lot of product development at the Dive as well, which gave answers to how to deal with new finance processes, for example, how to build a new organizational operating system which allows a living organization, how to come up with the idea of creating positive impact concerning this dimension of service delivery, how to create positive impact in the world, ecologically, socially, and so on. And also concerning the ecosystems, like I said before, we have strong ties to different communities. But what was always lacking was this idea of, but how is all of this reflected in the ownership and governance structure? And another complicated slide is this one, and I won't go through all the details. But as you were talking about the inner journey, maybe I want to point you at this little curve in the lower part of the slide. So we started with 4 co-founders, and during the process there were 2 other co-owners which we took on board. And as I said before, when starting the company in 2015, we weren't really aware of the fact that ownership matters. And we also were not aware of the fact that there are already other models out there, like, for example, Steward-Ownership, which we maybe also could apply to the Dive. So we started as a partnership, very low bar. And then at some point, 3 years in the game, we transitioned into German Limited, very traditional, which we still are until today. And then we had this spin-off in 2019-20 of the magazine. And this was, if you take this not as an emotional curve, but rather as an energy curve, I would say this was the first peak where we really were actively engaged in those steward ownership and basically ownership-related questions. And then the last of the initial co-founders left the company operationally in 2020, so that only 2 of the initial co-founders stayed in the company, which is me and my co-founding colleague. And this, I would say, around 2021, this was where we decided to really embark consciously and actively on this steward ownership process also for us with the Dive, accompanied by purpose, by the way. And then, of course, the first emoji which you see here is just all those kind of soul-searching discussions which we had, the 2 of us, like the 2 founders, because, of course, we were not always on the same page on each and every aspect. Then you can see the money flying off because we had to buy back the shares of all those co-owners and co-founders, where we had whom we had to compensate. which also puts a certain limitation to the further process, because then, and we didn't have any investors in the company, so everything was just made out of, compensated out of our cash flow. And then we had kind of a smaller, I don't know, hiccup very recently, because right now we are really in the practical process of drafting the constitutions, coming up with all the tax-related questions. And originally we planned to sign all the contracts in September this year. And then our tax advisor, a little bit surprisingly, told us that he doesn't feel confident to really advise the whole process. So we had to find also with your help, to find a new setup concerning the tax advisors, which we now have. So I'm pretty confident that we will be able to sign the contracts in November, more or less. Just some thoughts on boosters and hurdles. I think what definitely helped a lot was connection and community, just to exchange with other companies who are on the same path, like the thing we do here. To exchange with you guys, you'll never walk alone. We had an ongoing support, thank you very much. You didn't ask me to do that, but it was really very, very helpful from purpose. And I think, of course, everything around honesty and transparency, also concerning the journey and the process within the company, really helps. And this can be hard conversations, and I think we're going to dive deeper into that with you, Fabian, about compensation, about money, about deeper motivations of the founders, of the owners, about hopes and fears of everybody who is involved in the process. And we tried, we are organization developers, but still, if you do that for yourself, you're maybe not the best expert. So we tried to design the process in a way that we had enough rooms and enough spaces for communication and for exchange. And still, of course, it goes quite deep, not that much on a factual level, because we always have been a very self-organized company. So this feels very organic to us to kind of prolong self-management and self-organization into the realm of ownership. But still, it really goes, it touches on deeper questions, I would say. And hurdles, of course, there are financial limitations if you do this process on your own. As I said before, there are no investors, so we try to also do the compensation side on our own. There are legal limitations, definitely, and workarounds, so I always find it hard to bend and to stretch the system from within. You always have to find these workarounds, and I'm sure many of you know them. And that's what I also mean with, in general, systems change from the inside can be hard. I think many of those organizations who try to change something in the economic sector are somehow pioneers, and it's always hard to change the rules of the game while you play the old game, and then you have to find new rules, and this is kind of a paradox somehow. So these are just the first insights which came to mind, and I hope we will have the time to maybe deepen one or two of them later on. Thanks.